Yesterday's protests were spontaneous expressions of people who are exhausted with the Cuban government's economic mismanagement.
Well, no, they're being they're marching with the American flag. The Cuban people do not wish to live under the boot heel of this regime any longer. Part of what drives the sort of Obama-esque view of how Cuba ought to be treated is a particular view of the United States and its values. There's a view that Obama made mainstream on the left and had been mainstream back in the 70s, but kind of fell out of favor with the rise of the Reagan era, which was that America was inherently bad. America's involvement in Vietnam was bad. America's involvement in Iraq was bad. And America's involvement in Cuba is bad. America is the nefarious force in the world. And the real problems that Americans need to face down are the problems here at home. America doesn't have anything to say about what happens in the rest of the world because, after all, America is just too perverse. America is just too wrong-headed. America is just too much of a problem. So this has led, as I say, to this conflict inside the Biden administration. On the one hand, you have Joe Biden, who is speaking sort of classical Democrat language from the JFK days, talking about how the people of the United States stand firmly with the people of Cuba. Here was the president of the United States saying the right thing with regard to Cuba yesterday.
The Cuban people demanding their freedom from an authoritarian regime. And I don't think we've seen anything like this protest in a long time, if quite frankly ever. The United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba as they assert their universal rights. And we call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence, their attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
Okay, this is the right statement. Right? Credit where credit is due. Joe Biden is saying the right thing. The problem is his administration immediately started trying to walk a lot of this stuff back. So first, they said that the statement that he put out was written for him, right? Not by him, for him. Then Jen Psaki tried to downplay what was happening in Cuba as merely a sort of spontaneous eruption at the lack of economic opportunity and the problems with regard to vaccine distribution in Cuba. This is not true. It is not true. I've been talking to Cuban dissidents for the last several weeks. They were planning this sort of stuff for weeks on end. There was a burgeoning democratic movement in Cuba. I knew weeks ago that people were going to get out in the streets. People in Cuba knew weeks ago that they were going to get out into the streets. This is not just about the way the Cuban regime is handling its problems right now. And this, again, is a sort of pattern in the way that Democrats view the world. When a bad thing happens out there, they like to say not that it's a pattern that springs from the nefarious evil of underlying institutions, right? When it was Benghazi, it wasn't the nefarious evil of ISIS that was to blame, or America's soft stance with regard to security in places like Libya that was to blame. No, it was just a spontaneous eruption of upset over a random YouTube video. And now, according to Jen Psaki, what's going on in Cuba is a spontaneous eruption thanks to economic dislocation. That is untrue. It is not true. The Cuban people do not wish to live under the boot heel of this regime any longer. And downplaying what is happening in Cuba as some sort of like spontaneous reaction to current economic circumstance ignores the fact that a huge percentage of South Florida's population are Cuban expatriates who fled from the country specifically because it is an oppressive hellhole. Okay, here's Jen Psaki sort of downplaying the cause that people are fighting and now being imprisoned and probably dying for in Cuba.
There's every indication that yesterday's protests were spontaneous expressions of people who are exhausted with the Cuban government's economic mismanagement and repression. And these are protests inspired by the harsh reality of everyday life in Cuba, not people in another country. I'm saying that because I think there have been a range of accusations out there, as you well know.
Okay, and then she says, well, it was really the lack of vaccines that caused all of this. Trying to downplay this as lack of vaccines or spontaneous eruptions over the economy ignores the fact there have been people on the ground planning this sort of stuff for decades, fighting this sort of stuff for decades, not just in Cuba, but also outside of Cuba. We've talked to them on the program. Here's Jen Psaki, again, taking the sort of Obama-esque approach here.
Obviously, one of the issues that that protesters are justifiably out there in the streets protesting about is hunger, is lack of access to vaccines, et cetera. But we are continuing to provide a range of assistance, which we will continue to do.
Okay, now here's the problem. One of the big problems is not just the moral problem with sort of making light of the underlying evil of the Cuban regime. The bigger problem is that the solution that would seem to be called for by diagnosis of the problem as just COVID vaccines or lack of economic opportunity is you ship some money and some vaccines over there. Right? Just throw them some cash, throw them some vaccines, and then call it a day. That would seem to be the dictated solution. But that, of course, is not a solution. The solution is the fall of the regime. The United States can't necessarily effectuate that from the outside, but we certainly can do a whole hell of a lot more than simply talk about how, they may have botched this one. Peter Doocy from Fox News was back in the White House press room and asking the tough questions. So he said, yeah, so you guys keep saying it's about vaccines and the economy. I've noticed that they are not shouting vaccines and the economy. They are shouting freedom and enough. Here's Peter Doocy grilling Jen Psaki.
When these protesters are yelling freedom and enough, there are people within the administration who think they're saying freedom from rising COVID cases.
Again, I would say that when people are out there in the streets protesting and complaining about the lack of access to economic prosperity, to the medical supplies they need, to a life they deserve to live, that can take on a range of meanings. There's a global pandemic right now. Most people in that country don't have access to vaccines. That certainly is something we'd love to help with.
It could take on a range of meanings? Well, no, they're being very, very, they're marching with the American flag. And this is the point. This is where it gets very uncomfortable for Jen Psaki and the Biden administration. Again, they're of divided mind. On the one hand, Joe Biden wants to say that he's a patriot who loves the American flag. On the other hand, Joe Biden refuses to say to his left flank that they are doing something wrong in burning the American flag or stomping on the American flag or kneeling for the American flag. And this makes for a very uncomfortable situation for them when Cuba breaks out like this. Because when people of Cuba are flying the American flag and saying we want our freedom, and people on Joe Biden's left are saying America shouldn't get involved because America is the problem. America is bad. The true authoritarian threat is not from actual authoritarians. The true authoritarian threat is here at home. It puts Joe Biden in the middle of a vice. He's not willing to stand up to his left, and he's not willing to stand up for his own principles. Here was Jen Psaki having a tough time explaining why dissenters in Cuba are even flying the American flag. Now, for any normal person, any normal American, this is a very easy answer. The reason that Cuban dissenters, Cuban patriots are flying the American flag and not just the Cuban flag is because America stands for liberty, because the Declaration of Independence promulgates principles that are universal in nature, because the United States has been a beacon of hope for oppressed people around the world for centuries at this point. That is a very simple answer. And yes, it is wrong for Americans to disdain their own flag. There's something deeply ungrateful and wrong with it. Yes, they have a right to do it, but you have a right to do lots of stuff in America that's incredibly dumb and wrongheaded. You have a right in the United States of America to write moron on your own forehead. That'd be a stupid thing to do. Just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean you ought to do it or that you are right to do it. But the Biden administration does not have the stones to simply tell its own left, you guys are wrong on this sort of stuff. So this leads to the uncomfortable realization that Jen Psaki can't even just acknowledge the realities, which is that the Cuban dissenters are right and a lot of Americans are wrong.
Does the administration support international protesters flying the American flag, and what message do you have to Americans who are wary of flying it here in the U.S.?
Well, I would say first, the president certainly values and respects the symbol of the American flag. He's someone who certainly waves it outside of his house or does in Delaware and other places where he's lived throughout his time. But he also believes that people have the right to peaceful protest, and he thinks both can be true.
Well, both are true. You have a right to peaceful protest, and also the people who are protesting by disdaining the American flag are morons. They're world historical idiots. Both of those things can be true, but she won't say that. She won't say that. Instead, she'll downplay the Cuban protests as sort of a situational problem. She will ignore the fact that it is idiotic to protest the beacon that is the United States. And by the way, the more that the United States refuses to stand up for itself as a beacon of freedom, the less that American flag actually means to people around the world. You want to see dissenters stop flying the American flag? Please keep promulgating policy like this. In just 1 second, we'll get to the folks that Democrats are really threatened by, the folks that they really are worried about. It's not Cuban authoritarians. It is not the Chinese regime that just stomped all over Hong Kong. It's not the Iranian terrorists who run the country. No, they're worried about you. Really, they are worried about you. Anybody who is conservative, anybody who's center, right? Anybody who's center. All of you people are the people who they are worried about. You're the true authoritarian threat. How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.